On the 24th of October 2014, Sid Meier did something wild and released Sid Meier's Civilization Beyond Earth. Many players thought this might be the spiritual successor to Alpha Centauri. Others thought it would be a new direction for the Civ franchise. Let's put it into context. It followed a very successful, long release of Civilization 5, which, after its DLC came out, was largely regarded as a very good 4X historical strategy game. In fact, it's still the top rated on Steam of all time. A few years after Beyond Earth came out, we had Civilization 6, which is only just finished its post-release development many years after it initially released in 2016. So then where does that place Beyond Earth? Why did Beyond Earth only receive one DLC pack? And crucially, what is the good, the bad, the ugly of Beyond Earth? And is it worth a go now in 2022, while we wait for Civilization 7, having heard not really too much about it aside from the odd teaser here or there and the odd wishlist video here or there? And crucially, what's my perspective on it? After streaming it recently and playing it for a while, at the end of this video, I'll give you my own insights on whether I think it's worth a buy and how it fits. But now let's take a look at Sid Meier's Beyond Earth, this incredibly interesting and actually, dare I say, a game that I threw away many years ago out of ignorance, because I didn't enjoy it, and because I didn't think it was a very good game, and one that I've picked up more recently, and my perspective has changed. My name is Jumbo Pixel. If you like this kind of video, please do like the video, and let's jump straight in. So as I said at the start, Beyond Earth released in an awkward position, following the hot success flames of Civilization 5, and it wasn't received very well at all. It wasn't a terrible game, it worked, but many players felt it was a little bland, a little boring. It was harder to relate to. It didn't have the sophistication that we might have wanted, and it didn't, in many more sort of classical players' perspectives, live up to the greatness of Alpha Centauri. This did not deliver Alpha Centauri 2 for them. Moreover, the game felt a little underdeveloped, and as we moved through its life cycle, many argued that it felt like it was sort of abandoned by Firaxis. They sort of, oh yeah, this didn't work so well, sort of juggled it around like a bit of a hot potato and then just threw it out the window and thought, let's just make another historical one. And they went back to Civ 6. And that may very well be true. But something happened throughout Beyond Earth's release that changed the game. And it's something that I haven't covered on the channel aside from a live stream. And that is Civilization Beyond Earth Rising Tide. This video will focus on the complete Beyond Earth experience. For those who don't know, Rising Tide was Beyond Earth's one official expansion pack. It released roughly 1 year after the initial game on the 9th of October 2015, and this expansion pack changed the game. It sort of uplifted the somewhat stagnant, maybe slightly underdeveloped features of Beyond Earth, and gave them new life. I'll cover it off briefly here while also talking about what made Beyond Earth initially, these sort of gameplay features and how they were enhanced. For those who don't know, in a really short summary, when you finish a game of Civ 5, there's a prompt. It says, would you like to fly to the stars? And you can do that, and it'll open up Beyond Earth, right? It's kind of this successor. Here you can see on screen some of the gameplay features that set it apart. Things like health, for example. You will have also seen so far its tech web rather than its tech tree. Cities and workers will look very familiar to you, but of course the world will not. Indeed, it's an alien world, and the factions who live within it, or the sponsors I should say, are of course less relatable than the historical ones from other Civilization games. You won't find your Gandhi here. Sorry to say. The sponsors themselves, of course, like many other 4X sort of space strategy games, need to have more personality and more interest brought to them. Otherwise, I think it's hard for players to relate to them, especially when they're used to playing historical strategy games with familiar faces, right? So there's a level of disconnect inherent in these games that has to be brought and connected to the player better. Here you can see another interesting mechanic in Beyond Earth. This is the artifact system, and this bleeds into its discovery system, something that was, again, really made more powerful with Beyond Earth Rising Tide. Let me tell you a bit more about Rising Tide now, that we've got a picture of what the world looks like. Rising Tide, as many reviewers even would argue, added more depth to the game in a few key ways, aside from those new sponsors. It's nice to have new factions to play, but it's not the end of the world. It really, I would argue, added 4 key new differences. The first was toward the affinities system in the game. So in Beyond Earth you have virtues, and these sort of act like cultural policies from Civ 5. In fact, it's basically a cut and paste of those, as are many elements of the Beyond Earth game, particularly the base game. However, there's also an affinities system, a more sort of ideological system in the game, where you vie between supremacy over the aliens and world around you, or you can opt for harmonious policies and ideologies, or finally those seeking purity. In Beyond Earth Rising Tide, the game enabled us to move between and indeed simultaneously grow these affinities. This was not a feature in the base game where you just kind of had to favor one and level it up. It adds an incredible depth to the cultural, ideological system that underpins this game, and it helps make every playthrough more dynamic, more enjoyable. It was a wonderful addition, and it's one that I really enjoy. Next up, the expansion added dimensions to aquatic gameplay, but moreover, I would argue it made the world more dynamic, and it took it away from the very rigid structure that we received initially. What do I mean by that? Well, many would argue that this was kind of just a reskinned, retextured Civ 5, and the world in many ways reflected that, and you can kind of see it if you look at it now on screen. In the Rising Tide expansion, we were able to add truly more unique elements to our world. For example, ocean cities, but aquatic cities that can actually move. Literally moving cities. Much more interesting than the previous iterations that were in the game. Moreover, these aquatic cities were unique not just in the way that they looked or moved, but also in the way that they interacted with the game's system. They produced less unhealth. That mechanic that I showed you before, that's kind of like sort of like a take on happiness. It is much more related to your civilians, your population, their overall lifestyle, though, more than sort of an arbitrary happiness value, which is really only relating to luxuries and a couple of other things. This was more detailed. Of course, these cities will also produce more energy, more culture, and they're really great for naval units. However, as you can imagine, not so hot when it comes to their defensive bonuses and other things. Really good. Another really interesting addition to the Rising Tides DLC, and this, I would argue, actually, is maybe something that Beyond Earth does better than any other modern Civilization game to date. Perhaps even better than Civilization 6 after its many DLC renditions, and a particular focus in the later DLCs on that late game, on that diplomacy, on diplomatic relations, and how you sort of monetize or gamify diplomatic relations in-game by adding a currency to them, enabling trade, World Congress, so on and so forth. Beyond Earth Rising Tide used a completely new diplomatic system. This compared to the base game, which literally just ripped it out of Civ 5 and plopped it into an alien world. In Rising Tide, and I quote the developers, they completely rebuilt from scratch, end quote, the diplomatic system. Players, for the first time, earned a currency like we sort of do in Civilization 6, diplomatic capital. You'll see me use it in this game, and if you've played Beyond Earth, of course, you'll know how it works. But in a nutshell, you can sort of relate it to how it works in Civilization 6. Each faction uses their capital to buy personality traits for their leader, however. A key difference. Not only that, but of course you use them to exchange and trade deals, which you will have seen on screen. You can also use it for certain buildings, for certain wonders. It was a system that really also worked well because the AI had a real respect, I would almost say, in how they utilized the system. The AI, for the first time, felt like they were not perfect, obviously. This is a computer AI designed in 2015. But for the first time, it felt like it was actually more of a livable world and that the AI was able to engage in diplomacy that mattered. It really mattered. Moreover, when you entered a war, there was a war score mechanic. Not too dissimilar from that in Humankind, but really with some key differences throughout. When you enter peace negotiations, of course, the highest war support that you earn, that war support, the war score, whatever you want to call it, the more consensus you would have over the losing party. Again, kind of like what we have in Humankind, but maybe slightly more basic and slightly more streamlined, I would argue. Again, just my personal opinion. The other big thing that Rising Tide added to Beyond Earth, that players like me who played the initial base game and were maybe a bit disappointed by, was the role of exploration. Here I argue this is maybe even the most important one, beyond the hybrid affinities, beyond the diplomacy. Because in a world where, again, it's not entirely relatable, this is not Earth. This is a foreign place that we don't recognize. You're not about to walk out your door and see a giant alien worm burst out of a volcano with some weird yellow glowing coral resource around it that some farmer's trying to pluck off its back, for example. It's difficult to relate to it. Excuse that awful anecdote. The point here is that Rising Tide added exploration into the world, and that added more depth. Of course, the game initially had it. But here in Rising Tide, there were these artifact types that you've seen me deal with already. Old world relics. Artifacts. Alien biological artifacts. We could move around the world, find these artifacts, cash them in for quick bonuses, or, as you've seen me do, combine them to unlock wonders. Buildings. I believe even unit bonuses and promotions and other things like that. We were able to, I find, move into the world and engage with it in a much more real way. We're also able to discover a thing called planetary marvels. These marvels, when discovered, are sort of planet-wide quests, right? These missions. Missions that are actually throughout the entire game. Because the victory conditions, of course, in Beyond Earth work a little bit differently, and again, building to that story element, as you move through the entire Beyond Earth game, you are put these quests. You're put these challenges, these missions. And again, I argue, they help to build more of a real world, and one that we can interact with and engage with. Finally, there were a few other sort of smaller changes around the edges. Rising Tide added new biomes to the world. As I say, 4 new sponsors, 4 new factions to play as, each with their own unique history, of course. Don't forget the overall underlying storyline here is that Earth is kind of stuffed, and we're trying to find a new world. But, classic human nature, we're not really harmonious about how we should get there, how we should live in it, how we should treat the current population, the aliens, and whether we should extract it for its resources or protect it as a steward or guardian. That leads to, of course, a variety of different sponsors with political ideologies, beliefs, and that, of course, bleeds through to us as players into real mechanics in-game. Whether it be staples like unique units or buildings to ways that factions interact with the worlds and the aliens within it. Let's not forget that while this is not a direct Civ 5 clone, we can relate some of these features to games that we've already played. Aliens like barbarians. That's of course not true. The aliens have much more depth to them. If you annoy them, they'll come more aggressive, more stronger, or you can grow in harmony with them. There's also city-states that have been sort of stripped back and they really act more as just trading posts. But I would argue they're not really the key feature here because it doesn't really make sense in this whole narrative that I've just built around leaving the bad Earth and coming here and figuring out how to engage with this planet, that there would already be some barbarian city-states here first. How did they get there? Doesn't make sense. So I think in that light, Beyond Earth handles some of the less necessary features from other Civ games in a reasonable way. This brings me to my final thoughts in this last part of the video. My recommendations. Is Beyond Earth worth a buy? Is it fun? Should I play it? Should I wait for Civ 7 or wait for one of the many other great, look to be great, 4X real-time, historical, not so much historical, space strategy games coming out over the next few months. I've covered them already on the channel. You've got the likes of Falling Frontier, for example, a big one. Loads of people are excited for. I actually covered them all recently in a video that you can check out. Enough shameless plugs. Beyond Earth, for me, is worth a buy. And I can't believe I'm saying that. And if you went back in time, to the me of 2015, when this game released, I wouldn't have said that to you. Beyond Earth is worth a buy for me with the Rising Tide DLC. It's worth a buy for me if you can get it at around 75 to 80% off. I would not recommend, unless you're in absolute moneybags, that you go out in 2022 and buy this game at full price. That would be a terrible recommendation. However, this game is a good change of pace. With the Rising Tide DLC, it doesn't feel like a Civ 5 mod. It feels like a proper sci-fi successor to Civilization 5. It has depth, it has detail, and to be honest, with the addition of the Rising Tides DLC, I can genuinely say that I actually want to jump back into this game and pick it up again. Will I be playing it every day? No. And it's up against some tough competition moving forward, as I say. But as a reasonable pickup for, say, $10 or $15, add it to your Steam library, I can really recommend this to fans of sci-fi strategy and to fans of Sid Meier's and Civilization. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.